Do you believe a Bigfoot once saved a man from 30 years of unbearable guilt? In a small town long forgotten by time, a wild creature changed the fate of someone who had lived like a ghost among the living. The truth is, not everything labeled a monster is dangerous. Emmett, a frail, limping young Bigfoot, trembled like a frightened child abandoned in the dark. He didn't growl, he didn't attack. He simply stood there, afraid and aching for a moment of kindness. This story is drawn from the actual journal of a man named Walter Brinley, a former veterinarian who lost his wife and daughter in a cabin fire, a tragedy he blamed himself for, choosing isolation and silence for 3 long decades. But if you stay through to the end, you'll discover something unexpected. How a creature that couldn't speak a single word somehow understood what forgiveness meant. And how that same Bigfoot offered up the one thing that let an old man finally smile again after living in the shadows for half a lifetime. Emmett wasn't just a myth. He held onto Walter's old coat the way a lost child clutches a faded blanket. He sat alone in the rain, gently stacking stones into the shape of the burned-down cabin, the one place Walter never returned to. Not even once. No one taught him to do that. But somehow, he knew. And he forgave. If you scroll past this story, you might miss one of those rare moments that reach deep into the heart. A connection that crosses species, time, and sorrow. The kind that only happens once in a person's lifetime. The wind had a bite that night. One of those Elk Hollow winds that scraped the skin raw and whispered things through the pines you'd rather not hear. Walter Brinley didn't flinch. He never did. Not anymore. Wrapped in his wool coat, lantern swinging by his side, he followed the snow-packed trail toward the ridge behind his cabin. The kind of path only a man with memory in his boots would know. No footprints but his. No voices but the wind. He was checking the traps. Old habits die slow, and he still left them out, mostly to make sure nothing died alone and forgotten. That's how the guilt had trained him. The forest was darker than usual. Even the moon seemed reluctant to look down. And then, a sound. Not the sharp crack of a branch. Not the low growl of a bear. It was a whimper. He stopped dead in his tracks. The kind of stillness that sinks down to your bones. That sound didn't belong out here. It wasn't animal. Not quite. But it sure as hell wasn't human either. It was something between a child crying in their sleep and a dog that had given up hope. He turned, lantern raised. The beam cut through the fog, revealing the old well. Goddamn thing had been covered in vines for years. He hadn't thought about it in at least a decade. Last he remembered, it was just a circle of stone eaten by moss, sunken into the ground like a forgotten mouth. Now it was open, the vines torn, the edge cracked, and something was down there. Walter stepped closer. The air was heavy, like before a fire breaks loose. He crouched, peered in. What he saw didn't make sense. Not right away. There, about 10 feet down, chest deep in freezing water, was something large, covered in soaked fur, hunched, its arms curled around its body, shoulders shaking with every shallow breath. It didn't look up. Not yet. Walter's grip on the lantern tightened. The light flickered against the stone walls of the well. Then, as if the warmth of that small glow had called it forward, the creature slowly lifted its head. Their eyes met. One eye was cloudy, the other gleamed amber in the light. The face wasn't snarling. It wasn't wild. It was scared. Both hands rose, slow, trembling, shielding its face as if expecting a blow. The mouth opened just enough to release that same wounded sound, half wail, half breath. Walter felt something twist in his chest. Not fear. Something older. Something deeper. The sound of losing a child in the night. He didn't speak. Just reached for the coil of rope he kept in his pack. Dropped one end into the dark, slow and steady. The creature looked at it, then at him, unmoving. "Come on," Walter muttered under his breath, even though he knew it wouldn't understand. Maybe it would understand the tone. Maybe that was enough. It reached for the rope with hands that didn't look quite right. Too large, too rough, fingers bent in odd ways. One leg shifted, trying to stand. That's when Walter saw it. The twist in its left leg. The way it bent wrong. Like it had always bent wrong. He braced the rope and pulled. The creature climbed, clumsy and slow. Walter took a step back, putting all his weight into the lift. The thing was heavy, soaked, shivering, its fur matted with blood and dirt. Almost there, then the rope snapped. It didn't scream. It didn't even yelp. Just fell. Hard. The splash echoed through the trees like a shot fired in confession. Walter cursed and fell to his knees, leaning over the well, trying to see if it was still moving. The lantern caught just a flicker. One hand, still above water, clutching something small. A stone. Just a stone. It kept it clenched in its palm, like a child with their last secret. Walter didn't know what the hell this thing was. He didn't care. It wasn't a monster. He'd seen monsters. Real ones. They wore wedding bands. They made promises and broke them in fire. This wasn't that. This thing hadn't asked to fall. It hadn't chosen to be broken. It just was. He sat back, snow seeping through his knees, staring at the well. The night closed in around him like a question he didn't want to answer. He knew what he should do. Call someone, ride into town, tell them there's a thing in the forest, in the well, not quite man, not quite beast. Let someone else decide. But no, he couldn't. Not again. 30 years ago, he'd left his cabin for 30 minutes to fetch lantern oil. 30 minutes. When he came back, there was nothing left but flame and ash and silence that never ended. He'd lost a wife, a boy, a world. Now, in the pit of the forest, another soul was waiting. He wouldn't walk away this time. The wind howled as he stood, pulled his coat tighter. He'd come back in the morning with dry clothes, food, and better rope. The creature hadn't asked for help, but it had looked up, and sometimes that's all it takes. The forest swallowed him as he walked back, but the sound of that broken breath, the whimper from the deep, followed. Soft, ragged, unfinished, just like a lullaby never sung. The snow was falling heavier by morning. Not in a hurry, just steady, like time itself had slowed to a soft, white hush. Walter's boots crunched down the frost-laced trail as he carried a bundle wrapped in an old wool blanket under one arm and a tin lunch pail in the other. Inside the blanket was a battered lantern, 2 thick slices of dried bread, and a patched-up military coat that still smelled faintly of cedar and ash. He hadn't used it in years, not since Nora stitched it up for him after a bad fall up near Blacktail Creek. It didn't fit right anymore, but it would fit better on something smaller. The forest was watching him. That's how it felt. He moved quieter than usual, not out of fear, but because noise felt wrong now. The kind of wrong that hangs in your gut after you've looked something in the eyes and didn't know what you were looking at. The well was just ahead. Still open, still dark. Walter didn't speak when he got there. He didn't know what to say. Words didn't fit this sort of thing. He crouched, placed the bundle on a flat rock near the rim, and lit the lantern. The flame flickered like it was trying to breathe through the cold. He waited. Nothing. Only the wind threading through the bare branches, rattling the pines like bones in a tin cup. He sat down, slowly, his knees aching like old regret, and set the pail beside him. The heat from the lantern barely touched his skin, but it was something, enough to hold on to. There was a sound, not from the trees this time, from below, a slow scrape, like fingers on stone, then quiet. He leaned forward. The creature, no, the boy, the thing, whatever it was still down there, still curled up in the corner of the well, tucked into its own shivering limbs like it had tried to make itself disappear. Its head was low. It didn't look up, but it hadn't drowned. It was alive, still breathing. Walter placed the bread on the edge, one piece at a time, then took off the coat and laid it next to it. He didn't say anything, just slid the items toward the edge and stood back. Then he waited. The silence dragged out long enough to make a man question everything. Finally, there was movement. A shuffle. Then a hand, matted in soaked fur, claw-like but fragile, emerged just enough to hook one of the sleeves and drag the coat inward, disappearing with it into the dark. The bread remained untouched. Walter didn't leave. He sat for over an hour, watching the light sink and the trees lean in. At one point, he caught a glimpse of the creature again, this time huddled closer to the wall, draped in the coat. It wasn't eating. It wasn't sleeping. Just sitting there, watching. But the way it held that coat, it wasn't random. Its hands gripped the fabric like it meant something. Not warmth, something else. The way a child might clutch a blanket that smells like home. He came back every day, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk. He brought apples, boiled potatoes, boiled eggs in a rag. Most of the food stayed untouched, but the coat remained. Worn thin in spots now, clutched tighter. The fourth day, he built a lean-to out of pine limbs and canvas near the edge of the well. Nothing fancy, just enough to shield from the wind. Inside, he placed a first aid kit, a dry blanket, and a battered field journal with a pencil stub tucked in the spiral. He didn't leave the journal for the creature. He left it for himself. The first page, he just wrote a name. Emmett. He didn't know why. It just felt right. The next pages were filled with notes, not scientific, just human. Observations like, prefers shadows, moves only after sundown, watches, doesn't hide. Or, no aggression, flinches at loud sounds, avoids direct light, like a child. Each night he stayed a little longer. Sometimes he played a few slow notes on the old guitar he brought with him from the cabin. Sometimes he talked out loud, never expecting a reply, just letting the sound of his voice stir the quiet. He spoke of small things, of rain patterns, of the owl he used to feed by hand, of a daughter he lost in a fire and a wife who sang off-key in the mornings just to make him smile. One night, he wasn't playing, wasn't talking, just sitting. A shape rose near the edge of the well. He looked over and froze. The creature was watching him, not from the shadows anymore. It had climbed halfway up the wall, gripping the roots that clung to the stone. Its face was clearer now. The fur along the jaw was patchy. One ear drooped low. Its left eye had a faint milky veil. But the right eye, the good one, was watching him. Not blinking, not threatening. Walter didn't move. The creature reached into its palm, opened it slowly. A stone, just a simple flat stone. But the way it held it, with reverence, with care, it felt like a memory. Then, with a jerky, hesitant movement, the creature pushed the stone toward the edge and left it there. It didn't run, just backed down slowly, disappearing again into the well. Walter picked up the stone. It was smooth, polished by time or thumb. There was nothing special about it, except it was warm. That night he dreamed of fire again. The same cabin, the same smoke. Only this time someone else was screaming. Not his wife, not his boy. Someone small, lost. He woke before dawn, sweat cold on his back. Outside, the air was still. The coat was gone from the ledge, but the stone had been placed back, this time resting beside his lantern. He didn't ask questions, because something in him had already decided. He'd failed once, he wouldn't fail again. And though the creature never spoke, never stepped fully into the light, Walter began to believe that silence could be a language all its own, especially when spoken by something the world was never meant to understand. And still, each time he turned to leave, he looked back. Every time the stone was there, waiting. There were mornings when the forest felt like a cathedral, not because of light streaming in from above, but because of the silence, that thick, hushed reverence that made you lower your voice without knowing why. Walter moved slower these days, not from age, but from weight, of knowing too much and saying too little. He'd built a rhythm now, one foot before the other, tin pail in one hand, his old field journal tucked beneath the other arm, its corners softened by pine resin and breath-warmed pockets. The path from the cabin to the well had lost its urgency, but not its pull. Something in the earth seemed to remember each step, the way grief does. He'd stopped trying to name the thing in the well. Emmett was enough. Not a title, not an identity. Just enough. Some days, Emmett didn't show at all. Others, Walter would catch him watching, half lurking, half hovering near the tree line, crouched low like he didn't belong to gravity. Always silent. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was waiting. Walter began recording everything. Not like a scientist. Not like he used to when he worked under fluorescent lights and with leather-bound textbooks that never once mentioned anything like this. This was different. He wrote as if someone might need to know someday. As if someone might forget if he didn't. Prefers dusk. Blinks less when guitar's played. Watches hands, mimics motion, avoids metal, drawn to heat. Blinks when wind gusts. Keeps that stone like it's sacred. On the 4th night of December, Walter brought his guitar again. He didn't play a song. He just brushed the strings softly with his fingertips, letting the notes spill out like breath fog in the cold. He wasn't trying to entertain. He was trying to remember. He didn't notice at first. But something shifted. A movement. Not sudden, not loud, but enough to make him pause. He turned his head slightly. Emmett was there. Not hiding anymore. Sitting just outside the circle of lantern light, crouched low with both hands resting on his knees. Not threatening, not curious, just still. Walter didn't move. He kept strumming. Light pressure, gentle rhythm. Not a melody, just sound. And Emmett leaned in. It was so subtle, it might have been the wind. But then, Walter noticed the creature's right hand twitch. Then its index finger stretched slowly, tapping against its own knee. 1, 2, 1, 2, sinking to the rhythm, clumsy but intent. Walter didn't say a word, just nodded once, barely. The next morning, he found something beside the cabin door. Not food, not claw marks, just a small arrangement of stones, carefully stacked, 3 wide at the base, narrowing to 1 at the top, like a totem, or a grave marker, or a memory. And beside it, a single pine cone placed perfectly upright. It wasn't random. Not in this forest, not from Emmett. Later that week, snow started to fall harder. The air turned sharper. Walter built a larger lean-to near the well, this time with canvas tarps and old military blankets nailed into the earth. He lit a lantern each evening and left it burning till the wick burned dry. And Emmett came closer now, sat longer, eyes half closed like he was listening, not just watching. One night, Walter was speaking to the fire, not really talking, more like whispering confessions into the crackling wood. He told it about his wife's laughter, the way she used to dance barefoot in the cabin just to get their boy to laugh. He spoke about the night the storm rolled in too fast, how the lightning hit the oil lamp, how he was only gone 27 minutes, and when he came back, nothing was left. Not even the walls, not even bones. He hadn't cried in years. But that night, he did. And something shifted in the shadows. Not a sound, just the faint pressure of presence. When he opened his eyes, Emmett was there, barely 6 feet away, closer than ever before, crouched low, shoulders curled inward like a question mark. One hand reached out, not touching, just hovering, just above Walter's worn boot. The long fingers twitched once, then went still. Walter didn't pull away. He just sat there, breathing quiet, letting the silence do what no language could. By morning, Emmett was gone again, but not before leaving something behind. Near the base of the guitar case, Walter found small, smoothed pieces of bark, carved. Not expertly, not beautifully, but with effort. 4 small slabs, each etched with lines. One had what looked like trees, another a fire. The third, a figure beside a smaller figure. And the last was a cabin. Crooked, lopsided, but unmistakable. It took Walter longer than he liked to accept what he was seeing. Emmett remembered. He remembered what was said, what was played, what was mourned. The mimicry wasn't survival. It was connection. It was the kind of echo that only comes from being unseen too long. The next time Walter played guitar, he left the case open. Let Emmett see the strings. Let him see the shape his hands made when he pressed against the frets. And Emmett reached. Slow, careful, like touching a ghost. His fingers trembled across the lowest string. A hum, barely sound, but it was there. And Walter saw it in his face. Not just instinct, but memory, recognition. Like somewhere inside that broken frame was a boy who once listened to lullabies through the floorboards. He wrote it down that night. Not for science, not for records. Just one sentence. He's not a thing. Then crossed it out. He's a child. And yet, even as things softened, even as trust grew like moss over stone, something colder brewed beneath it. Something unspoken. Walter felt it each time Emmett flinched at shadows. Each time he retreated at sudden movements or loud sounds. This was not just a creature of the woods. This was something that had been thrown away, something left behind. And for the first time in decades, Walter felt something dangerous grow in his chest. Not fear, but the urge to protect, to shield, to hold. That night he didn't play guitar. He didn't light the lantern. He just sat there in the dark, watching the faint breath of Emmett rise and fall in rhythm with the forest. And for once, the darkness didn't feel empty. It felt shared, held. But far off, beyond the tree line, something snapped. Not a twig, not an animal. A motion, a presence, gone before it had shape. But enough to make Walter sit up straight. He wasn't the only one watching Emmett anymore. And the forest, for the first time in weeks, didn't feel like a cathedral. It felt like a trap waiting to spring. It started with the snow. A thin layer overnight, soft enough to kiss the grass, but thick enough to take a print. Walter noticed it first thing in the morning, just after coffee, before his boots even hit the frost-hardened porch. He'd been looking out, expecting nothing. Same woods, same quiet. But something snagged the corner of his gaze. A trail. Not deer, not bear, bigger. He followed it with his eyes first, then his feet. The tracks led east, cutting through his usual path to the well. Broad steps, uneven in spacing, too long to be human, too light to be elk. His gut twisted, not with fear, with knowing. He didn't need to follow it. He already knew where it ended. Emmett was gone. No sign of struggle. No scent of blood. Just the clean, wandering path of something that didn't know where it was going but had to move anyway. Walter stood still for a long moment, his breath clouding in the morning air, the warmth from his mug fading fast in his hand. He set it on the railing, turned, grabbed his coat, and went after him. The prints led through the underbrush, across frozen creek beds, and up toward the ridge. Every few yards they paused, like Emmett had stopped to listen, or hesitate, or maybe just to breathe. Walter moved fast at first, then slower, when he realized the tracks weren't fresh. This had happened hours ago, probably in the night. He found the broken fence mid-afternoon, an old split-rail line that used to mark the back of the Heverly property, now half buried under frost and ivy. And just beyond that, more prints. Smaller ones, boots, several pairs. Children. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the far side of the hill. Not cruel, just careless. Like the kind of noise made by people who've never had to be afraid. Walter crept forward. Below him, in the clearing near the edge of town, 5 kids were building snowmen. Bundled up, red-cheeked, shouting half-formed rules for some game they'd just invented. And past them, on the far side of the clearing, was a tall shape crouched behind a collapsed woodpile, barely visible in the shade. Emmett. Walter stopped breathing. Emmett was still. Not hidden well, but not moving. He wasn't approaching, just watching. His head tilted slightly as one of the kids spun around, arms flailing, trying to catch a snowball in his mouth. The laughter echoed again, and Walter saw something shift in Emmett's shoulders. Like a memory had landed too hard inside him. It wasn't hunger in his eyes. It wasn't envy either. It was longing. Something older than language. Walter didn't move. He knew if he shouted, Emmett would bolt. If he got closer, he might spook the kids. So he waited, watching both worlds from the tree line, praying they wouldn't intersect. They almost didn't. Until the smallest of the kids, a little girl in a green parka with one broken zipper, spotted something. She didn't scream, just froze, stared. The others noticed, one by one, turning toward the wood pile. Walter's pulse spiked. Then one of the boys picked up a rock. It wasn't big, just a reflex. The kind kids have when they don't understand something, when they feel something primal in their spine but don't have the words for it. He threw it. It missed, but it hit something. The silence that followed was deep and sudden. Emmett flinched hard, ducking back, slipping as he tried to retreat. The girl screamed then, a pure, cutting note of fear. Walter burst forward, not shouting, just moving, fast. Through brush, over the ditch, toward where Emmett had vanished back into the woods. He didn't look at the kids, didn't check to see if they were okay. They would be. They weren't the ones bleeding. He followed the broken prints back into the trees, and he ran. By the time he found him, Emmett was curled beneath the old hunting blind 1/2 mile west. Not crying, just hunched over, his good hand pressed against his shoulder, blood darkening the fur around his collarbone. Walter crouched slowly. No words, just presence. Emmett looked up. The stone was still in his other hand. Walter didn't ask why. He didn't need to. That night, back at the lean-to, Emmett didn't go back to the well. He stayed near the small fire Walter built, crouched in the shadows just beyond the light, licking his wound like an animal but holding the stone like a child with a photograph. Walter patched him up the best he could. No gauze, just cloth. No antiseptic, just boiled water and patience. Emmett didn't resist, didn't retreat. When it was done, Walter left him be and returned to the porch of his cabin. He sat there for hours, guitar silent across his lap, the town lights twinkling faintly down the hill like lies told gently. He thought it was over, until Nora showed up the next morning. She didn't knock, just stood at the bottom of his steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You've been hiding something," she said. "And now the town's full of rumors, big footprints, scared children. You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" Walter didn't lie. He never had with her, but he didn't tell the truth either. He just said, "There's something in the woods, something scared, that's all." Nora squinted, then sighed, and said nothing more. That night, Emmett returned to the lean-to on his own, limping, holding a small pile of snow in his hands like it was a gift. He placed it on the stone where Walter always left food. Let it melt. Beside it, the blood-stained rag Walter had used the night before, folded neatly. And the stone, always the stone. But now it was cracked down the center, as if the memory it held had finally been dropped. The mountain air had a different weight that morning, thinner, restless, carrying the scent of snowmelt and something missing. Walter stood in the doorway of his cabin, hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, eyes pinned to the edge of the trees like he could will the silence to speak. No footprints, no broken branches, no blood, just absence. Emmett was gone. The lean-to still stood, undisturbed, firewood dry. The flannel blanket folded just as Walter had left it the night before. Only one thing was different. The stone. The cracked one Emmett always kept close. It wasn't there. He didn't panic, not right away. Not the way a man loses his breath when something breaks. No, this was slower, like a tide pulling back. He checked the trail. Nothing. He called once, quiet, not foolish enough to shout. Then he waited. Hours passed. The light grew sharper, then softened again. Still no sign. By sundown, the last warmth drained from his fingers. And that's when the ache started. He didn't eat, didn't build a fire. Just sat near the edge of the clearing, hat pulled low, staring into the dark like it might open up and return what it took. But it didn't. By the second night, Walter convinced himself he should let go. That maybe this was right. Maybe Emmett had found what he was looking for. Gone back to whatever wild corner he'd been dragged from. Maybe he wasn't meant to stay. Walter said it out loud, to no one. And it tasted like ash. By the third day, he stopped pretending. He missed him. Not as a creature, not as a secret, as a boy. That morning he folded the flannel blanket, pressed the cracked stone he'd kept inside his coat pocket down into the center of it, and placed it on the step. He didn't think Emmett would see it, but it felt wrong not to leave something behind. It rained on the fourth night, hard. Walter sat up long after the lantern went out. He listened to the storm like he used to when his wife was still alive, counting the seconds between the thunderclaps, waiting for the roof to groan. He closed his eyes sometime after midnight, and he dreamed of footsteps, heavy ones, slogging through mud, a shadow outside the window, and a knock. Not loud, just enough. He woke in the dark, his chest tight, ears still ringing. He didn't move right away. Part of him didn't want to break whatever spell had reached into sleep and pulled him halfway towards something that felt like hope. Then he heard it again, not thunder. A knock, soft, deliberate. He stood, slow, bones grinding, moved to the door, opened it without thinking. Rain washed across the porch like it had a purpose. Wind curled through the trees. And in the center of the threshold, soaked through, fur matted and clinging to his bones, stood Emmett. Not standing really, not proud, kneeling, his good hand trembling, his breathing sharp. In his fist, something wrapped in cloth. Walter stepped forward, reaching without hesitation. He dropped to one knee, close enough now to smell the wet earth on Emmett's skin. The boy, no, not a boy, but not anything else either, held out the bundle. It was charred, torn at the edges, but unmistakable. A fragment of fabric, deep red once, now blackened. Walter knew it before he even touched it. The embroidery was still there. The edge of a flower, the corner of a letter. Something only one person could have made. His wife's scarf. It had vanished the night of the fire. She'd worn it wrapped around her braid. He'd never found a trace. Never expected to. And now it sat in his hands, returned by something the world would call a monster. Walter's throat burned. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. He wrapped the cloth tight, pressed it against his chest, and sat back on his heels. Emmett leaned forward, slowly, until their foreheads nearly touched. No words. Just breath. Just silence. The kind that healed. Later, Walter built a fire. Emmett curled near the hearth, one leg tucked awkwardly under him, the other stretched long and still favoring the bad side. He didn't sleep, just stared at the flame. And in his hand, again, was the stone. Whole this time, as if it had never cracked. Walter sat across from him, guitar beside him, untouched. He didn't play. Instead, he reached for the field journal. He opened to a blank page and wrote, "He came back. He brought her with him." Outside, the storm broke. The forest held its breath. And deep beneath the floorboards of that old cabin, something shifted. Not in the earth, in the air, in the weight of it all. He was no longer alone, and neither was Emmett. But far off, somewhere past the ridge, another door was opening. Not a cabin door. Something colder, hungrier. Rumors were already rolling through the town. Children talking about shadows. Men bragging about prints they'd found too wide to be bare. Eyes in the dark. The sheriff brushing it off, but still doubling patrols. They didn't know his name, but they were looking, and Walter knew now. He wouldn't let them find him. Not again, not like this. The forest was already choosing sides, and winter wasn't over yet. The dogs came first. Echoes of them, far off in the timber, not barking but howling, long, urgent, metallic in the cold. Walter froze at the chopping block, axe halfway through a half-frozen log. The wind carried the sound too clearly, too close. He hadn't heard dogs in the forest in months. No one brought them up here unless they were chasing something. Or someone. He set the axe down slowly. His hands didn't tremble, not yet. But something else did. Beneath the ribs, an old thrum, the kind that warns you long before your mind catches up. He scanned the tree line. It was just after dawn. Sky the color of bruised steel. Nothing moved. No birds. No wind now. Just that stillness. The kind that came before fires. Or men with weapons. He didn't run. He walked. Back to the cabin, boots scraping frost, each step deliberate. Inside, he grabbed the lantern, the flint kit, the old .22 rifle he hadn't loaded in over a decade, and left the guitar behind. No time for softness now. The path to the lean-to was worn deep, but he veered wide, cutting through brush to mask his trail. Snow shallow but noisy. He moved fast. Branches clawed at his coat. His breath pulsed white. The dogs were closer now. Too close. He could feel them like heat rising behind him. When he reached the lean-to, it was empty. No Emmett. No stone. Only the imprint in the earth where he'd slept last night, curled in that way he always did. Like a question that never got answered. Walter crouched, eyes scanning for signs. Then he saw it. A new set of tracks. Heavy. Human. 5 or 6 pairs. Thick boot prints, not townsfolk. Too wide. Too straight. No hesitation. And near the base of the hill, cigarette butts. Crushed. Fresh. He picked one up. Menthol. Then the voices came. Low. Sharp. Southern drawls, clipped like old rope. Walter ducked. He recognized the tone. The way men spoke when they carried authority they didn't earn. One barked something about shootin' on sight. Another laughed. He backed away, slow as breath. Circled toward the hickory grove near the old ice house ruins. That's where he found Emmett. Not running, not hiding, just standing. Back to a wide tree, hunched low, arms folded across his chest, eyes wide. Not with terror, but something deeper. The kind of fear that knows escape isn't coming. Walter stepped into the clearing, slow, hands open. Emmett's head turned just slightly. His eyes were wild. His chest heaved. One leg twitched with pain. Blood smeared down his left side, not fresh but not dry. The scarf Walter had given him was gone. Walter whispered low. Calm, pointless words. Just sound, just proof he was real. But Emmett didn't respond. The dogs broke through seconds later. 3 of them. Black-tongued, thin-ribbed, hackles raised, muzzles wet with spit. They stopped hard when they saw him, saw both of them. Then came the men. 6 of them, some younger, some older, all armed. Shotguns, flashlights, camouflage. The one in front had a mustache like wet straw, and eyes that didn't blink enough. He pointed his gun right at Emmett. Walter moved between them before he realized it. Hands up. The man shouted, "Step aside!" Walter didn't move. The man shouted again. One of the others raised a flare gun. Red plastic, aim too high. Walter spoke. "He's not dangerous." The man laughed. "You out of your mind?" Behind him, one of the dogs whined and backed off. The youngest hunter, barely more than a boy, took a step forward. "He's just standing there." Walter turned. Emmett hadn't moved. Not a muscle. He looked smaller now. Or maybe it was the light. The way the clouds shifted and made his outline blur. He wasn't snarling, wasn't baring his teeth. He was just waiting. The man with the mustache didn't wait. He fired. The shot rang through the forest like a church bell cracking in two. But it didn't hit, because the boy, the young one, had knocked the barrel aside. The shot tore into a tree instead, splinters flying, dogs scattering. Everything froze. The flare gun hit the dirt, and Nora stepped out of the trees. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't run. She just walked, like a ghost with a purpose. Hair wet, eyes hard, hands holding nothing but certainty. "I called the sheriff," she said, calm as stone. "He's on his way." The man with the gun hesitated, mouth half open, not fear, not quite, but close. "You shoot again," she said, "and it won't be just him you'll have to answer for." The air held. One of the other men lowered his weapon. The boy stepped back. Walter still stood between them, breath short. Emmett dropped to his knees, not in surrender, just exhaustion, his arms wrapped around the base of the tree. A sound left his throat then. Low, not human, but not beast either. A cry without words. The kind that asked for something older than safety. The men left, grumbling, cursing. But they left. One by one, they vanished into the woods. Dogs whimpering behind them. Only the boy lingered, stared a little longer, then turned, and was gone. Walter dropped to one knee beside Emmett, checked his breathing. Still shallow, but steady. He pulled the coat tighter around him. Nora stood a few feet away. Her voice broke the quiet. "He didn't fight." Walter shook his head. "No," he said, voice cracking. "He begged." And somewhere deep inside them, something gave way. Not out of weakness, but out of knowing that some things are too sacred to hunt. That night, Walter didn't light the lantern. He didn't need to. The moon was enough. And Emmett, curled against the wall of the cabin, didn't flinch when the wind moved through. He just held his hand to his chest, and in his palm was a stone, whole, but trembling. By the time the first frost came back, the well was gone. Walter and Nora had buried it together. Not with machines, not with cement, just with their hands and shovels and the kind of silence that said more than any eulogy could. They piled earth and stone until the opening was no more, until the dark mouth that had once swallowed a boy whole had been sealed shut by the very man who once reached in to pull him out. Emmett had gone again. This time, not in fear, not wounded, not hiding. He left on his own terms. One morning, Walter found the lean-to empty. No blood, no prints. Just the scarf, folded neatly, and the journal, his own journal, returned with the last page filled. Walter hadn't written it, but the drawing, the crude, childlike sketch of 3 figures standing under a crooked tree. One tall, one small, one hunched slightly but whole. He recognized them all. He ran his thumb over the pencil lines until they blurred, then closed the book and said nothing. The town had settled into winter as if nothing had happened. The men with guns had stopped bragging. The dogs didn't bark so deep into the woods anymore. The sheriff never filed a report. Nora never told the story. She baked more often, though. Left warm loaves at the edge of Walter's property line every Friday. Sometimes wrapped with cinnamon sticks, sometimes not. Walter pretended he didn't see her watch him from the trail. But something had shifted. Quiet things started happening. Children, the same ones who'd screamed in the clearing weeks ago, began whispering about a shadow. Not a monster, not anymore. Just a shape. A tall figure seen through trees. Watching, never moving, never chasing. And in the mornings they'd find things. Not scary things, not traps or signs. Baskets of pine cones arranged in spirals. Little stick cabins built carefully near schoolyard fences. Bundles of berries placed on porch steps like offerings. Someone or something was giving back. At first the adults laughed, dismissed it, blamed each other. But one morning, a girl brought in a drawing. Crayons on lined paper. She called it The Man in the Fog. It looked nothing like a man, but the eye, one cloudy, one clear, was unmistakable. Walter saw it tacked to the corkboard in the general store. He didn't touch it, just stood there long enough for Nora to notice. She didn't speak, just refilled his coffee and waited for him to blink again. Word spread slowly, not like gossip, more like rain soaking into wood. And people began changing. Not fast, not publicly, but small things. A boy who'd never smiled much began leaving scraps of bread under the spruce tree outside his house. A woman who'd once chased anything strange from her backyard started hanging apples from string in the branches instead. And someone, no one would admit who, carved a small sign and nailed it to the edge of the old forest trail. Let him pass. Walter didn't ask for any of it. He didn't tell them to stop. He just watched. Some mornings he'd wake up and find the porch swept, fresh twigs stacked by the firewood rack, a heart-shaped rock on the step, balanced perfectly. Once, a tiny woven ring of bark sat atop the journal he always left open outside. And still, there were no footprints. No sightings, only stories. Some said he lived in the mist now, that he only showed up during the first snow, that if you left bread near the hollow and meant no harm, something kind would visit your dreams. Walter never corrected them. He couldn't. He still wasn't sure where Emmett had gone, but the stone remained, on the mantel, untouched. That winter, Walter didn't lock his door. Not once, and on nights when the wind picked up just right, he swore he heard something beyond the howl of trees. Not words, just a rhythm, like breath, like footsteps, like forgiveness. And even as the town went about its holidays, hung their lights, packed their sidewalks with salt, one thing kept happening. Each morning, under a cedar tree behind the schoolhouse, a loaf of bread would appear, always warm, always untouched. And beside it, on certain days, small branches bent into shapes no one could explain. Hearts, cabins, a single curled letter W. The children started calling it the forest gift, and they'd leave their own. Drawings, mittens, little notes written in block letters that simply said, "You can come back if you want." And once, in the snow, where no one should have been, where no one could have walked without leaving trails, there appeared a perfect imprint of a hand, too large to be human, open, facing up, like it was reaching for something that hadn't been given yet. Walter saw it before anyone else. He didn't tell a soul, just stared at it in the hush of dawn, let the snow fall soft into the ridges, and whispered the only thing that felt true anymore. I remember, and for the first time in years, the silence felt like it was listening. The fire burned low that winter, not out of neglect, but because Walter didn't need much heat anymore. The cabin held its warmth differently now, like it had remembered how to breathe. The wind outside had softened into a hush, not dead, just quieter. Even the trees seemed to move slower. Time in Elk Hollow didn't tick the way it used to. It drifted. Walter sat in his old chair, the one Nora had restuffed years back, the one that creaked when he leaned too hard on the right armrest. The guitar leaned against the hearth, untouched for days. The fire snapped now and then, as if trying to remind him it was still there, still alive. So was he, though not in the loud way anymore. Not the way he used to be. His breath had become quieter, his steps more deliberate. His body didn't work like it once had, but his heart, God help him, still remembered everything. He had started sleeping lighter, waking before the first light hit the pines, sitting on the porch wrapped in his coat, the mug in his hand empty, more out of ritual than thirst. Every morning he watched the mist roll in from the south like an old friend coming down the hill, and every now and then, just every now and then, he saw it, the print, not always deep, sometimes just an indentation, just enough to catch the frost and glint in the light. A reminder, Emmett had never said goodbye, but he hadn't vanished either. He was still out there, still watching, still returning. Walter never tried to find him again. That wasn't how this worked. You didn't chase something sacred. You waited, and you trusted it would know the way back. Nora came by more often now, not with questions, just meals. Sometimes she'd sit across the fire and read aloud from old newspapers, half laughing at things neither of them cared about anymore. They didn't talk about Emmett. They didn't need to. The space between them had filled with something heavier than words. One night, when the snow was high enough to seal the bottom half of the screen door, Nora stayed until the lantern flickered. She rose slow, joints stiff, and before leaving, placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "You still light the porch at night?" He nodded once. She looked at him a moment longer, then whispered, "Keep doing it." And she was gone. So he did. Every night just after dusk, he'd light the small lantern and place it by the door. The flame wasn't bright, but it was steady. It wasn't for people. It wasn't for him. It was for whatever moved through the trees when no one was looking. A sign that someone was still waiting, that someone still believed. Weeks passed like snow falling on a silent roof. No thuds, no crashes, just a soft layering of time. Walter stopped marking the calendar. The cabin told him what month it was better than ink ever could. One morning, after a night of wind that howled too much like voices, he stepped onto the porch and saw it. A shape in the snow, just one, a handprint again, deep, clean, facing upward. Next to it, a stone. Not cracked, not old, brand new. Smoothed river rock, still damp like it had been washed with care. A tiny strand of red thread wrapped once around the middle. He knelt, picked it up gently, and held it in his palm until his hand warmed it. That night he didn't light the lantern. He left the door cracked open instead. The wind didn't enter, but something else did. He woke once, to the sound of breath. Not his, not close, just present. Like something was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching him sleep, not in fear, but in knowing. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he felt it. A quiet that wasn't lonely anymore. The next morning, footprints circled the porch once, then veered into the woods, and disappeared. No trail, no drag, just gone. He stood in the doorway, hands trembling but not from cold. And for the first time in a long while, he whispered one word out loud. Home. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. Down in the town, stories still passed from mouth to mouth, of someone who guarded the woods, someone who left pine cones in perfect circles, of a child who wandered too far and came back carrying a wild flower no one had seen bloom in years. They said there was a spirit up there, a creature made of fur and memory, a shadow that never hurt, just watched, just waited. And when the children dared each other to leave breadcrumbs at the edge of the forest, they'd come back the next morning to find tiny stick figures left in return, sometimes in the shape of cabins, sometimes in the shape of hearts. Sometimes just two hands, side by side, carved into mud. Walter never claimed the stories. He just listened, and kept the porch swept. The guitar stayed quiet those days, but not forgotten. One evening, long after the sun had dipped, he sat by the fire and let his fingers drift across the strings. He didn't strum, just pressed. Felt the vibration settle into his bones. The light outside dimmed, but in the fog just past the clearing, two amber eyes blinked. Once, and were gone. The next morning, Nora found the fire still warm, the mug still half full, the chair empty, and the stone still smooth, still warm, resting on the windowsill, exactly where Walter used to set it before he went to sleep. The door had not been forced. There were no signs of struggle, only the faint impression of something heavy having knelt just outside the threshold. And beside it, pressed into the snow, a single, perfect footprint, larger than a man's, but left like a promise. There are stories that rattle like chains in the dark, meant to scare, to stir, to warn. But then there are those rare few that move quieter, like a wind through the trees or a memory you didn't know you still carried. Stories that aren't meant to be understood fully, only felt. This has always been one of those. Because some truths don't come wrapped in answers. They come in the quiet between heartbeats, in the echo of footsteps where none should be, in a glance that says, I see you, without ever speaking a word. And in those moments, when the world isn't looking, we're reminded. Compassion isn't weakness. It's the oldest kind of strength. Sometimes, what the world calls monstrous is just something wounded, lost, or forgotten. And sometimes, what the world leaves behind learns to forgive anyway. This story wasn't about survival, not really. It was about return, about the long, slow walk back from silence, about how grief leaves spaces that only gentleness can fill, about how time doesn't heal everything, but kindness does something even better. It honors what was broken and lets it breathe again. It says, you still matter. Because healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it creaks like floorboards in a cabin long abandoned. Sometimes it shivers in the fog. And sometimes it just waits. with a lantern lit and the door cracked open. This story leaves us with no clean ending, because there never really is one. Love echoes, memory lingers, and the ones who choose mercy over fear, they don't disappear. They become part of the land, part of the hush, part of the stories whispered by firelight and believed by children before the world teaches them not to. So if you've ever felt out of place, or left behind, or unspoken for, maybe this was for you. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you walk past the tree line and feel that prickle down your spine, that pause in your breath, you'll stop and listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched you in any way, we'd be honored to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what stayed with you. And if you'd like to join us on more journeys like this, quiet, strange, full of heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story with someone who still believes in the unseen. Until next time, keep your lantern lit. You never know who might be finding their way home.